Most Minnesotans work hard and are getting less for it than ever before. The wealthiest few take a bigger and bigger share of the profits from all of our hard work, while the rest of us struggle to get by. Nationwide, here's who saw their income increase since 1980. The lowest paid 20% barely increased at all. The middle class, the folks between the lowest paid 20% and the highest paid 20%, didn't do much better. The folks in the top 80 to 99% of incomes did a little better, and the top 1% saw their income almost triple. And even though they were the only ones getting a raise, the highest paid 5% in Minnesota also paid a lower share of Minnesota state taxes than everyone else. Notice the distribution of taxes started off pretty fair in 1990, but in the last 2 decades, state taxes on the wealthiest 5% plummeted, leaving the rest of us to pay their share of the costs for roads, bridges, schools, and more. Because the wealthy weren't paying their fair share, everyone else had to pay more. And even though we were paying more, it still wasn't enough to avoid cuts to services. One result of this policy has been an increase in child poverty. Serving more kids living in poverty puts more pressure on our public schools and requires more resources. But instead of investing in our schools, tax cuts for the wealthy led to a reduction in state funding for schools. Schools got less money at exactly the time they needed it most. Some schools made up for it with property taxes, which put more burden on working people and didn't entirely make up for the loss. To make matters worse, these cuts weren't evenly distributed. Students of color bore the brunt of the cuts, contributing to a morally unacceptable inequity between white students and students of color in Minnesota. These inequalities didn't just happen. Some people are doing really well in this economy, and they're using their power to make sure it stays that way. For example, the CEOs of some of the biggest corporations in Minnesota each made over $10 million last year. Ecolab CEO Doug Baker made $10.6 million. U.S. Bank CEO Richard Davis made $10.8 million. Ex-Target CEO Greg Steinhoffel made $12.9 million. Xcel Energy CEO Ben Folk made $15.7 million. 3M CEO Inga Tulin made $16.4 million, and Travelers Insurance CEO Jay Fishman made an unbelievable $29.9 million last year. And who's holding these highly paid CEOs accountable? Each other. Executives from big companies sit on each other's boards of directors in a system of interlocking directorates. It works out pretty well for them. They approve each other's salary raises, give each other bonuses, and look the other way when corporations misbehave. These CEOs aren't satisfied to just rake in millions of dollars, though. They also work together to protect rich people from paying their fair share of taxes through groups like the Minnesota Business Partnership. U.S. Bank's Richard Davis is the chair of the Minnesota Business Partnership. Ecolab's Doug Baker is the fiscal policy chair. Mary Brainerd from Health Partners chairs the Health Policy Committee. Bob Folk, Greg Steinhoffel, and Inga Tulin are also members. The Minnesota Business Partnership lobbies to lower taxes for corporations and wealthy Minnesotans, raise health insurance premiums for public employees, and replace public school funding with vouchers for private schools. Last year, the Minnesota Business Partnership spent $1.5 million to lobby for their agenda, and spent another $1.2 million on contributions and independent expenditures on state election campaigns. Ordinary Minnesotans have to struggle to have their voices heard against so much political money and power. In this corporate-run economy, St. Paul residents have suffered. Over 10,000 homes were foreclosed on. St. Paul lost 7,500 jobs from 2007 to 2012, and still needs 6,000 jobs to get back to 2007 employment levels. 25,000 children live in poverty. That's 1 out of every 3 St. Paul kids. And the St. Paul schools have lost funding in real dollars, making us more reliant on corporate donors to make up the difference. To make up for inadequate funding, the St. Paul Public Schools Foundation raised almost $1.7 million for education, led by representatives of Travelers and Ecolab, who are joined by Target, U.S. Bank, 3M, Xcel Energy, and Health Partners. That all sounds great until you remember that $1.7 million is less than the Minnesota Business Partnership spent lobbying and funding campaigns to cut taxes and reduce school funding. And that's just what they spent through the Minnesota Business Partnership. The businesses that give to the St. Paul Public Schools Foundation have collectively spent $80 million on lobbying in the last 10 years. And they've collectively avoided paying over $6 billion in taxes through loopholes and offshore tax havens like Bermuda, Hong Kong, and the Cayman Islands. The $1.7 million they give to the St. Paul Public Schools doesn't even begin to make up for what we would gain if they'd just pay their taxes and stop lobbying. Next time the St. Paul Public Schools says they don't have money for programs that would help our community, it's important to remember why they don't have it. More and more, parents, students, teachers, and community members are coming together to demand a fair economy in which everyone pays their fair share and in which schools, families, and communities have the resources to give every child a fair chance to reach their potential.